Hello, this is SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and welcome. This will be a series focusing on the Great Pyramid and the Egyptian Royal Cubit and looking at the connections in regards to measurement, some of the history in regards to the study of the Great Pyramid, and also especially metrology and the very important applications of this that carry through to our modern world. So the rulers of Egypt, as in the rulers themselves, but also the ruler as in measure, but the Great Pyramid and the Egyptian Royal Cubit. So the cubit rod itself, they change over time, and they're said to be, and this change is also said to be so as a new pharaoh would come in, the length would change because that would be based on the measures of that particular king or pharaoh's body. And there are roughly 14 known examples of a complete cubit rod and the connections to them, and these we'll be examining the cubit as was used on the Great Pyramid, not those of the later dynastic period, but on the Great Pyramid, which also applies to the other pyramids of Egypt as well. Just like in the Bible and the Code of Hammurabi and so many of these ancient texts, the importance of weights and measures is repeated constantly. And so, for instance, in Spell 25 of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, I have not reduced a measuring vessel, I have not reduced a measuring cord, etc., etc., in regards to weights and how important this is to a civilization. Standardized weights and measures are basically the foundation stone of civilization. So we're beginning with prior to the Egyptian Royal Cubit, and at least in the modern sense, especially in the European sense, the study of the Great Pyramid. And we could go back to John Greaves, mathematician, astronomer, antiquarian, or you could call that an ancient historian. That was another term for it. He conducted one of the first surveys of the Great Pyramid. His survey was very influential for a time, and Isaace Newton or Charles Piazzi Smyth were influenced by the theories of John Greaves, and he introduced what was called the Pyramidal Inch, and it went through variations, but it really began with John Greaves and it carried through. So one pyramidal inch is said to be, anyway, 1.00106 imperial inches, and the concept behind this was that the modern scales of measure were actually connected or derived from the Great Pyramid and other sites in Egypt. It's also worth noting that shortly before John Greaves was born, the mile, as we know it now, was introduced by Queen Elizabeth I. Edmund Gunter was chiefly responsible for this metrological measure work. And prior to this, now I've done some videos on it and I won't go into it now, but there's a bit more to it. So the modern English foot is actually quite old, and essentially the measure seems to have been the same, just the divisions of the units changed, but that's irrelevant really for the moment. The concept is that the foot of 12 inches and how this was encoded in law, and how directly following this, for instance, the King James Bible, they describe New Jerusalem in furlong instead of stadia as in earlier versions. And 1 furlong is 666 feet, or 10 Gunter's chain, as in Edmund Gunter. But what was also very important, or one of the defining aspects of this school of thinking derived from John Greaves, Isaace Newton, and Charles Piazzi Smyth, was this concept. They were very invested in linking the Great Bible and Judeo-Christian history with the Great Pyramid, especially when at the time they thought the world was 5,000 years old, and they were trying to calculate how old the world was by counting backwards through the generations of the Bible back to Adam and Eve. This was so it wasn't just about measure, but it was also this very concerted effort to place the Bible and Jesus and the story of the Israelites onto the Great Pyramid. And we can see a reflection of this still to this day, as Ben Carson famously said, was that it was quite widely believed previously, still with us today, that the Joseph, the coat of many colours, for instance, and that the pyramids were grain stores. And I'll put the link in the description to this magazine published 1884, the International Standard, devoted to the discussion and dissemination of the wisdom contained in the Great Pyramid of Giza in Egypt. And it has a lot to do with, well, the Bible and weights and measures, international institutes for preserving and perfecting weights and measures. This is a key feature of this magazine, which is also reflected in the work of Charles Piazzi Smyth and Isaace Newton and John Greaves. It's also, so there I've enlarged it, all in favour of advancing truths, blah 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 blah, revelations of a Great Pyramid. We will kindly communicate with the President, by whom also subscribe. So this also shows that the influence that this particular way of thinking in regards to the pyramid weights and measures and the influence it had, because Chester A. Arthur, the president at the time, was a subscriber to this magazine. It also, down here, we see the Committee on Standard Time, and we have Professor Charles Piazzi Smyth. Here we see the highlight of it, the Astronomer Royal for Scotland. He was an astronomer, but Charles Piazzi Smyth was a follower of the pyramidal inch ideas. He believed they could be used to extract a chronology of history from the Great Pyramid via the Bible, and the diagram above comes from his work, Our Inheritance in the Great Pyramid, published in 1877. And so these measures and the counting of the courses of the pyramid and the pyramidal inch and the measures of certain aspects of a pyramid were used to basically justify the biblical account of history. And so this is prior to that. So the idea that the world was roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years old, and counting back to Adam and Eve in the biblical sense, was a very important feature, and it runs throughout this particular school of thinking at the time and very much influenced them. And they started with their idea, and then they were looking to prove it. Now, in the book, I've just taken a few screenshots, but for instance, Mr. Guinness has shown most probable duration of our Lord's life. Jesus was the life on the earth was 33 years, 7 months and 7 days, and how they were using this to define, basically working backwards and trying to, to say that the pyramid is like a historical document connected to the Bible, or page there, whether the Great Sphinx was what Professor Smyth thinks it is, the biggest idol in the world, and that this was again mentioned in the Bible. So this movement was very much driven by trying to connect biblical events and timelines, or establish a timeline based on biblical events to connect to the pyramid, the Sphinx, and these ancient temples in Egypt and elsewhere. It was also very much the colonial thinking of the time, and so sort of still stays with us. And for instance, the Greeks are given credit for so much maths, and it still lingers with us that we cannot accept that the ancient Egyptians who were able to build the Great Pyramid couldn't wrap their heads around Pythagorean theorem and some other maths that we freely give credit to the Egyptians, to the Greeks, who themselves learn off the Egyptians. And yet, anyway, that's one of these thoughts and these philosophies that you can see running throughout this period, was essentially very Eurocentric, very colonial, and very biblical in that way. Charles Piazzi Smyth was also an astronomer, and astronomers especially were very important in doing longitude and latitude, and also time. And so, for instance, 1861, in Edinburgh at the dock, at the port, the 1 o'clock gun was used to create a standardized center of time. And 1853, the year before that, this particular this edition of this magazine was published, America got its first standardized time across the USA, but it wasn't legislated. It was actually the train operators who wanted, because every town, every city had its own time. It was basically, you would look at the church clock or the jeweler's clock or wherever the clock was, and each city, town had variations in there, and maybe if it was only a few minutes, but this caused big problems for trying to coordinate the railways and for people to get to the railway station on time. So it was actually private train operators who introduced the first working standard in the USA. It wasn't until 1918, I believe, that it was legislated to create standardized time zones and this type of thing. But time is very important in regards to this because it will connect these measures, especially the Egyptian Royal Cubit, the metre, and the foot. So the pyramidal inch and the general thinking of the time was very Eurocentric, Christian, and try to to validate a version of biblical history. And for instance, the Great Pyramid, and this is John Greaves' diagram, and we see the Grand Gallery there. Here's a picture from inside the Grand Gallery, and as another example of trying to connect to Jesus, especially from John 12, the famous miraculous draught of fishes, where 153 fishes were caught in the net. Well, the Grand Gallery, as it was measured back then, was said to be exactly 153 feet. However, there's an interesting footnote in regards to that because, well, for instance, the actual length of the Grand Gallery is 153.14, give or take, again, this one, a few hundredths of a foot. And if you multiply that by pi, you get the height of the pyramid. However, I want to do some more research on this, but for instance, if a pyramidal inch is 1.00106 imperial or English inches, then a 12 inches to make a foot, well, if you multiply 153, pyramidal feet of 12 pyramidal inches multiplied by this conversion rate, we get 153.16. So close to this measure here. So I want to pursue this a little bit more, but the point is that when John Greaves and some of his earlier studies were made of a pyramid, the rubble was obscuring the base, and it was difficult to get a accurate measure, and also the techniques and the individuals involved weren't necessarily the most skillful of surveyors. So this was a big problem. This rubble was eventually removed, and then we come to the beginning of the modern period of Egyptology and Matthew Flinders Petrie. He basically wrote the book, which was still pretty much a standard now, The Pyramids and the Temples of Giza. Just like the international standard, I'll put the link to this document in the description. His survey showed that the base of a Great Pyramid was several feet longer than the survey of John Greaves. Again, a bit of a typo there, but so the pyramid was actually wider at the base than what John Greaves had previously thought. So his survey pretty much remains amongst the best to this day, and with this survey, Petrie's father was a believer in the pyramidal inch and his sort of biblical-based concepts, but with William Matthew Flinders Petrie, this was pretty much abandoned in the favour of a new system for measuring ancient Egyptian temples and constructions, and that was the Egyptian Royal Cubit. This was based on the records, because especially more records were read, and there's literally describes the systems and the units of measure in these older texts and carvings, but also physical evidence with cubit rods such as this being found. And so the Egyptian Royal Cubit became the standard for measuring or studying the Great Pyramid and other such places. Though exactly how long is an Egyptian Royal Cubit? Surviving cubit rods have it between 0.5235 meters to 0.5292 meters, depending again on also the era. So what we're looking at is the pre-dynastic Egyptian Royal Cubit are separated from the later ones, which tended to be a little bit longer. The measures changed between the older and towards like the Middle Kingdom and that type of period. Though let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, because I think there's still, and we'll investigate this in the next episodes, there's still something of interest in these older theories, excluding the biblical history, but the measurement systems and these connections, and we'll be looking at that closer in following episodes. So Cheers and have a good one.